All right, everyone, in this lecture, we're going to be talking about neuroanatomy. So unfortunately, my brain is in my office on campus, and we're not allowed to go on campus. So it is what it is. So we'll do our best with the little drawings I can find to put on the slides for you here. So first of all, what we want to state is that our brain is divided up into two hemispheres. We have our left hemisphere and we have our right hemisphere. And interestingly enough, the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body and the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. I'm not sure why it is that way. It seems kind of counterintuitive, but I guess that's the way God wanted it. So that's the way our brains are developed. Now, in order for the two hemispheres to communicate with one another, we have a band of interneurons that make up what's called the corpus callosum. And this allows information to travel from one hemisphere to the other. And we have an interesting video on a lady who had a split brain operation where they had to remove her corpus callosum to relieve symptoms of epilepsy. And so in the video, you'll be able to see what types of deficits she suffers from when the two hemispheres cannot communicate with one another. But it's always interesting because sometimes you'll read on the internet that we only use, what percent or, 20% of our brain or whatever. And that's not necessarily true because if the brain cannot communicate, we cannot use the whole brain, then there's a lot of things that we're unable to do. So anyways, that is the corpus callosum, a very important part of the brain. And in fact, all the different parts we're going to be talking about are going to be important. You'll keep hearing me say that over and over again, but yeah, they're all important, I guess. All right, so next we have the cerebral cortex. This is the part that lies on top of the brain. This is, when you look at the picture of the brain, it looks like intestines. It's all these mental folds that are made up of the neocortex or the cerebral cortex. And what's interesting about this is that this is what gives us the size of our brain compared to the animal species. And interesting enough, all of our higher cognitive processes, such as decision making, problem solving, thinking, and so on, are controlled within our cerebral cortex. And so that's why animal species that have bigger brains, such as monkeys and humans, have much more intelligence than those who have smaller brains. And in fact, here's an interesting picture that shows you the different sizes of the brains. You'll notice that on the right-hand side where you have the human brain here, this whole area is the neocortex. But compared to a snake, this little area here in red is all its neocortex has, and then in a fish, just this little area right here. And when you think about it, what do fish and snakes really do? Fish kind of swim in circles. They eat a little bit, but other than that, they don't do a whole lot. Snakes kind of slither around the ground. They try to catch food to eat, but besides that, I don't know what else they do. But anyways, what they do have that's kind of interesting is this olfactory lobe right here. In comparison, it's a really large part of the brain on both the fish and also down here on the snake. And what the olfactory bulb is responsible for is the sensation of smell. And what's kind of interesting about that is that when you look at the brains of the fish and the snake, or actually the face of the brains, or the face, of the snake and the fish, their eyes are on the side of their face. And so in order to navigate, they have to use their sense of smell to get around. And that's probably why they have a larger olfactory lobe. In the human brain, I can't show you because I don't have a picture of it, but it's a very small part of the brain. And what's interesting about that is that as we age, the olfactory lobes start to deteriorate. That's why you may have some grandparents, for example, or elderly people that you know, and when, for example, they put on some aftershave or some cologne, they put on a whole lot because they can't smell it. And so it's just something that happens as we age. But anyways, next we have the different lobes of the brain. There are four main lobes of the brain. We have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. So the frontal lobe is located at the front of the brain right up here. It's responsible for regulating emotions and cognitions, and also it houses the motor cortex. And a good way to remember this is that before they had surgical and medical procedures to treat people who had schizophrenia, one thing they used to do is get an ice pick and stick it up inside the eye socket into the frontal lobes of the brain, and they would destroy the brain tissue up there in the frontal lobes that controlled their emotions. And that's how they were able to remove their hallucinations, illusions, and paranoia. But the downfall of that is that they were pretty much like zombies after that because they could not emit or express any type of emotion. On top of the brain, we have the parietal lobe. This is where the primary sensory cortex is going to be located. And in a minute, I'll show you a picture of both the motor and the sensory cortexes. In the back of the brain, we have the visual cortex. This is where we process visual information. And a good way to remember this is if you ever fall down and hit the back of your head, sometimes you may experience seeing stars or seeing lights or something like that because we have stimulated that part of the brain. And then finally, the temporal lobe is located on the side of the brain, kind of above your ears right here. That's responsible for audition, memory, and also language processing. So those are the 4 lobes of the brain. Here is a picture of what we call the sensory homunculus. So if I took my brain and sliced it in half and then opened it up, this is what you're going to see. And what can happen is that we can actually get an electrode and stick it at various parts of the sensory cortex to see what part of the body you're going to feel a tingling sensation. Now, we can do this because there are no pain receptors within the brain, and so it's not going to hurt us. And sometimes they have to use this when people have brain surgery, so that way they don't delete an important area of the brain. But what you'll notice is that there's a very large area devoted for the face and for the hands, and that's because we have a lot of sensory receptors located in those parts of the brain. And a good way to explain this is that your sensation of touch is much more receptive or much better at those areas of the brain than other parts. And so the example I always like to give is that, say your boyfriend is going to give you a kiss, would you rather be kissed on your cheek or on your knee? You should say your face unless you have some kind of fetish or something, who knows. But the reason being is that you have much more sensory cortex devoted for this area, so it's more receptive to touch than over here on your knee. Same thing you'll see with the motor cortex. We have a lot of area devoted for the mouth and the hands. And even though we may have bigger muscles in our biceps or in our thighs, we have a lot more fine muscles located in our face, and that's responsible for facial expressions, for chewing, for speech production. And also we have a lot more motor commands that we can do in our hands. We have a lot more dexterity in our fingers than we do in our toes, for example. So that's why we have a lot more area devoted to those parts of the brain. Moving along here, along the brainstem, we have the medulla of the pons and the cerebellum. Those are going to be the important parts there. So the medulla and the pons are responsible for vital bodily functions such as heart rate, respiration, blood pressure, sleep. And if these parts of the brains are destroyed, then the person may have to be put on a respirator for artificial respiration to stay alive. And sometimes when they say that a person is brain dead, what they may mean is that these parts of the brain have been destroyed so that they cannot sustain life on their own, and they need artificial means to stay alive. Hindbrain, here we have balance, motor coordination, muscle tone, muscle control. And what you'll find out here is that when we ingest certain types of toxins such as alcohol, it's going to inhibit these brain structures from producing this type of behavior. And so that's why the police may give you a field sobriety test when they assume that you've been drinking too much, because that's going to be the first part of the brain that's affected by alcohol intake. And then finally, we have the reticular activating system. This is responsible for arousal, attention, alertness, concentration. And this is implicated in attention deficit disorder, or ADHD or ADD. And so this is kind of counterintuitive too, because usually when they medicate people with attention deficit disorder, they give them a stimulant. They give them Ritalin or Adderall or something like that. And so you may ask yourself, well, why did they give a person who seems to be hyperactive a stimulant? Well, the reason being is that within the brain is not able to arouse itself because it has delayed maturation. And this is why you'll see more boys with ADD than girls, because boys' brains maturate slower than girls do. And so you may have a boy who's in kindergarten at 5 years of age, their brain isn't fully developed yet, and so they have problems with arousal, attention, concentration, and so on. And so usually what they do then is they have to be hyperactive. They have to act upon the environment. They have to pull Sally's hair. They have to walk around the classroom. They have to talk out of turn. They have to be disruptive because that's how they keep the brain activated. If not, they'll probably just fall asleep at their desk. And so what happens then is when you give the medication, which is a stimulant, that is going to artificially arouse the brain. And so now, because the brain is being activated by the Ritalin, you don't have to worry about them acting out anymore. And it is kind of interesting when you see people take their medication before and after, because it's kind of like a big difference, assuming that's being properly medicated. The problem that we have today is that ADHD is one of the most misdiagnosed illnesses in children. And so a lot of kids who just have behavioral problems are being misdiagnosed with ADHD. And so you can imagine what happens when a kid who's just a behavior problem is given a stimulant on top of that. Is just going to make the problem much worse. And so we need to be very careful when we make our diagnoses that we give them the right diagnosis, because if not, it could lead to some serious problems. Interesting enough, they've also discovered that one thing that seems to be related to ADHD is gaming. They have found out that when kids do a lot of video gaming, especially when they're younger, they are used to having a lot of stimulation arouse the brain. And so then when they have to do solitary activities like writing and reading and stuff like that they have to do in school, the brain cannot activate itself, and they have problems doing those type of solitary activities. And so what a lot of school psychologists are now doing with kids who have been diagnosed with ADHD is they're teaching them how to play games, like do puzzles and board games, so they can learn to do those type of activities that don't have a lot of arousal. So all that's kind of interesting. I wish we had more time in the videos to talk about it, but if anyone has questions, we could talk about this in our weekly Zoom session. Moving on to the brain, we have the limbic system. So here we have the thalamus, which is also known as the sensory relay station. So all incoming sensory information from our nose, our ears, all over our body is sent to the thalamus, and then it's going to be sent to the proper cortical areas. The hypothalamus is located above the pituitary gland, and it has 4 specific functions. And the 4 F's, first of all, are feeding. The hypothalamus regulates the hunger and thirst centers. And what can happen here is that if there is damage to our hypothalamus, it could lead to eating problems such as what's known as hyperphagia. So this is what we call the fat rat. This rat has had its hypothalamus lesion to see what would happen. And what happens here is that the rat will continue to eat and eat and eat, and the skeleton just expands as much as it can, and you get what's called the fat rat. Because the rat never gets a signal from the hypothalamus to tell it to stop eating. Same thing with the phagic rat. We get the opposite. We get the skinny rat, where we lesion a different part of the hypothalamus, and there the rat will never start eating even if it's hungry, because the signal from the brain doesn't get sent to the body to initiate the action. Also, we have fighting and fleeing responses, also known as the fight or flight responses. We'll talk about these in the chapter of motivation. And also, all of our mating behavior, our sexual arousal, is regulated by the hypothalamus. Now, technically, it also begins with the letter F, but I can't write it down, so just use your imagination. I think you can figure out what that would be. But all of our sexual hormones that are related to sexual arousal and also to sexual maturation during adolescence are regulated by the hypothalamus. And finally, we have the limbic system over here. We have the hippocampus, which we mentioned before is the formation of memories, but not the permanent storage site. Also, the amygdala is responsible for anger, rage, and aggression. So we have some interesting videos you can watch about this, especially the one on Phineas Gage. And also the pleasure centers of the brain, such as the septal area, are located here. Now, what happens with this area is when a person, for example, ingests a chemical such as cocaine, it will have an immediate effect on the septal area, which is why certain drugs have a quick addicting property, because they produce stimulation to the pleasure centers or the septal area of the brain. So anyways, that's just a quick overview. Once again, if you guys have questions, be sure to ask during our weekly Zoom session or on the Q&A discussion board, and we will